بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. So Alhamdulillah, we're almost completed with the Tafsīr of Sūrah al-Ḥashr. As you say, we plan and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala plans, and Allah's plan is always dominant. So as Shaykh mentioned towards the end, he had intended to finish Sūrah al-Ḥashr, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ma sha'Allahu kan, wa ma lam yasha' lam yakun. What Allah willed happened, and what He did not will did not happen. In any case, we'll start with the summary, inshallah. We see that the surah, they have a connecting theme. So if we look at this surah and we go back a few ayat from where we started today, we look at the ayah, لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا. That if we were to reveal this Quran upon a book, you would see it khashi'an, you would see it humble, right? You would see it humble, mutasaddi'an, it would cleave and it would split min khashyatillah, out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We saw a very similar theme and similar ayah to this in Surah al-Hadid, okay? Which was أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. That is it not time for the believers that their hearts become soft, right? The same word khasha', right? Takhsha' and khasha' coming from the same root letters, right? So we see that repetition in Surah al-Hadid, and then we see it again over here. And in the last Tafsīr session, Shaykh Amin had pointed towards this ayah being a jab at the Ahlul Kitab, because the Kitab is supposed to give you ilm. The Kitab is supposed to give you ilm, and the definition of ilm is the khashya of Allah. You're supposed to be khashya'. You're supposed to have the khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah is taking a jab at them, and He's reprimanding them by saying that you're not actually people of Kitab. You're not people of ilm, because this Quran, it has such an effect that even if it were to be revealed upon a mountain, then the mountain being as large and tremendous and as it is, it would have split asunder from the khashya of Allah. But your hearts have become so hard, right, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions even in Surah al-Baqarah, right, that there are rocks that fall and they split from the fear of Allah. But your hearts have become more, referring to the Ahlul Kitab, your hearts have become more hard, become more hardened than those rocks. And we see the same idea in Surah al-Hadid, after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the believers that isn't it time for them for their hearts to become softened for the remembrance of Allah. He says, وَلَا يَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ مِنْ قَبْلِ. Okay, so it's again connected to the people of the Kitab, that don't become like them. So yes, this ayah in Surah al-Hashr, it is reprimanding the Ahlul Kitab, but the mentality of the believer and the approach of the believer to the Quran is that he makes every ayah, or she makes every ayah for themselves. What do I take from this? So what we take from that is just like the Ahlul Kitab are reprimanded for their nifaq and for their hypocrisy, in that the Quran does not have an effect on their hearts. The same applies to the believer. The believer also has to think that I should not be like the Ahlul Kitab, that the Quran should have an effect on me. Okay? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins describing Himself. Okay? And that's where we had last week, Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa hu. Okay. So what is it that brings the khushu' in the heart? What is it that creates this khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It is the recognition and the ma'rifah of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. And that's what the Quran came to do. The Quran came to introduce people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Now we can take these two ayat, or these last three ayat of Surah Hashr, that start with huwa. Okay. Now if you go back to the beginning of the surah, okay, you'll see that there's also a mention of huwa that was there in the beginning. هو الذي أخرج الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب. Okay, He is the one who expelled the people of the book. هو الذي أخرج الذين كفروا. So it's beautiful that the surah starts with sabbaha, which was in the madi, it's in the past. Okay, it's really just truly beautiful. You see that the surah starts with sabbaha, right? That everything glorifies Allah, states His purity. Then the ayah that we ended with today, you use the masdar, subhanallahi amma yushrikun. Right? So the masdar is, in English we call it the gerund. Right? It's kind of what you add the ing to. Right? So you walked, that's the past tense. Okay, will walk, that's future. Is walking, present. Then you have the action itself, which is walking. Right? Just the action of walking. So over here in this ayah that we just finished today, we had the gerund, subhan. Right? That's the gerund. Okay, that's the masdar. And as we'll see, inshallah, beginning of next semester, you'll have the present / future. Yusabbihu lillahi ma fi samawati wal ard. Okay, so it's beautiful in the sense that the surah encompasses every aspect, subhanallah, every form that could be there that has to do with time or is even devoid of time. Right? So in the sabbaha, you have the madi, okay, you have the past tense there. In the last ayah, you'll have the mudari, you'll have the present and the future. And then before that, you have the masdar, which has no time attached to it. Right? So Allah is pure, pre-eternally, always and after, and even when there's no time. Allah is always pure. It's beautiful how the surah just kind of comes together, and how we start with huwa in the beginning of the surah, and then we end the surah again with huwa. So you notice that all of these last three ayat, they all start with huwa. Okay, so it's a very powerful way to wrap the surah together. Okay, and then something that Shaykh Amin mentioned, a few things. There's a lot of things that are mentioned today. Is this concept of what we have of, right, jam'u tabad. Right? Jam'u tabad means the coming together of opposites. Okay, so in one sense you have the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the being of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, and then you have all of these sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's where you have the kathra. Okay, so when you have the unique aspect, right? That's the wahda, it's one. And then you have the multiplicity, right? Which is the multiplicity of the attributes and the names, that's the kathra. But as Shaykh Amin pointed out in the beginning, it's one being, right? So the multiple names are for one being. So you have this jam'u tadad, right? So these are keys to the ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Okay. Then we also have it in the sense of the names that we saw. Right? If you, especially the ayah that we covered today, there's almost a point in the ayah where you can mark that this is the transitioning point. You transition from the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that highlight the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the jamal, the rahmah, And then from there you move to which shows his grandeur and his power, right? So you have Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, Al-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, and then you have Al-Aziz, right? Supreme, Al-Jabbar, right? He forces the compeller, Al-Mutakabbir, okay? You see that there's a very noticeable and observable change in the taste of these names, okay? Then something that Sheikh Amin mentioned, I think that's very important, is that to understand these names, we must understand all of these names through the lens of najah or salvation. Okay? That for us to understand these names, we must first understand a very primary principle, that salvation comes before everything else for the human being. Okay? So for a human being to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the human being must recognize that in the hierarchy of things that a human being needs to achieve, the first and primary checkpoint that a human being needs to achieve is salvation. And everything else is there to facilitate salvation. Okay? So that's where we saw Shaykh Amin's emphasis when he was discussing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names As-Salam and Al-Mu'min, that there's one aspect of security that has to do with security from physical threats. Right? There's one aspect of peace, which is a physical peace. Right? And then there is another aspect, and which is in fact the more important and the primary aspect, which is that of being safe and being safe from sin. Okay? And that is the primary focus. Okay? So now I want to connect this back to the beginning of the surah. We have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expelling Banu Nadir from their lands. You can now connect this to As-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin. Okay? Because what did the Banu Nadir do? They violated the pact that was between them and the Muslims. Right? There was treason there. Treason compromises security, it compromises salama, it compromises security and safety. And on top of that, they chose disbelief. So that is the lack of safety, that is the lack of security. Since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is As-Salam and He is Al-Mu'min, He is the one that facilitates peace. He is the one that facilitates safety and security. And He is the Muhaymin. He is the one that is the supervisor and He protects. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expelled them because He is As-Salam, because He is Al-Mu'min, because He is Al-Muhaymin. And to do that, you have to be Al-Aziz. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Aziz. Right? They couldn't stop Him. Right? That's where you get Al-Jabbar from. He compelled it. And that's very clearly shown in the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about expelling them. وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ مَانِعَتْهُمْ حُصُونُهُمْ مِنَ اللَّهِ فَأَتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَمْ يَحْتَسِبُوا. That they thought their forts would protect them from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah is Al-Aziz, Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir. No one can stop the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He does as He wills. But over there you see the apparently opposite names. You have As-Salam and then you have Al-Jabbar. You get a very different feel in your heart when you hear these two names. But they're actually complementary. That by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being Al-Aziz, Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir, that's how He deals with the transgressors, and then He facilitates As-Salam. And He facilitates Al-Aman. He facilitates safety and He facilitates security. Okay? So this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He manifests His names. And there's actually no contradiction between these names. There's complete there's is completely complementary, right? It complements, his names complement each other. Now, and then something that Sheikh Amin he focused on was what we spoke about even at the beginning of the surah, is that as human beings, right, every name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a certain demand from us. It demands us to behave in a certain way. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a salam, then a Muslim must also be a bearer and someone that facilitates safety. Okay, that's why when the Prophet ﷺ, he defined the Muslim, said al-Muslimu man salima al-Muslimuna min lisanihi wa yadihi, or kama qala alayhi salatu wassalam, that the Muslim is the one man salima, right? Same root letters, who others are safe from the harm of his uh, from the harm of his tongue and his hands. Right? And then another hadith with the Prophet ﷺ is defining a mu'min. He says, is that person cannot be a believer, man la ya'man jaruhu bawa'iqah, that his neighbor is not secure from his harm. Okay, so if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the facilitator of salam and is the facilitator of safety and security, the believer also has to facilitate safety and security, number one, in their individual interaction. Right? So as far as their own nafs, they have to protect themselves from sin. Right? So that is the safety and security that we must afford our own nafs. Then when you expand the radius, you now have your family, you have your neighbors, you have Muslims. They must also be safe from your physical harm, and you must also afford them security and safety by removing sin from their life in whichever capacity that Allah has given you to do so. Okay? And then when we expand that radius and we start thinking about how do we view a state, right, then the function and the primary focus of that state must also be to afford safety and security. Right? And again, we must do so within the purview of najah, within the purview of salvation. That how do we, as a state, how does a state facilitate for the inhabitants and the citizens of that state to attain salvation? Right? It does so by providing salama, by providing safety and security, that they can pursue their salvation without any fear. Right? That's the function and that's the purpose of a Muslim state. Okay? So another thing that Sheikh Amin had kind of really focused on, and I know we're running out of time, but I just kind of wanted to touch on it, is that we often see this today in Muslims, that I think it's kind of almost like it's just because something that is fun to do. We like to bash, right? We like to bash and badmouth Muslim countries, right? Understandably, there's much frustration with a lot of what happens. Okay, but what we have to understand is that we have to work with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Okay, so sometimes we get caught in this trap of what I like to call this idealistic framework of thinking, right? And it's sometimes it might be perhaps too simplistic and naive, right? Where we kind of think that, okay, I'm going to overhaul all the infrastructure that's already there. I'm going to overhaul the entire system, and I'm going to airdrop a khilafah. That's not how it works. Right? What's in your wusar? What's in your capability? Everyone's capability is going to be different. Right? Most practical for us is to work with the infrastructure that we have to better that. How can we facilitate the ideals of safety and security? How can we facilitate with the Muslim states that are there already? How can we how can we supplement the infrastructure in those countries and in those states to allow people to pursue their najah without fear? Right? Now, just one point of clarification: we're not calling for leaving the ideal. Right? So I think that's where the dichotomy happens, is that people often they get caught on two ends of the spectrum. She's like, oh, you shouldn't worry about the ideal at all. Well, that's not what Sheikh Amin said. Right? Sheikh Amin said, no, we're not saying leave the ideal. You have the ideal. That's something that you work towards, but the plan that you have to draw has to be practical. Right? So if you're going to be practical, then you have to think about, okay, what's the existing infrastructure that I already have? What are the resources that are available to me that I can use, rather than just sitting there and daydreaming that, okay, I'm going to airdrop a khilafah. It's not how it works. Right? So there are some very practical lessons for us there today. Right? I think key from them being, how do we bring salama and amana in our own life? And that starts with iman. Right? A mu'min is someone that has iman, and iman means to give security. So we are giving ourselves security against sin. Right? And that will give us security in the akhirah. That's our najah, that's our salvation. So we start with there. That's what the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-mu'min, demands from us. So we start from there. Right? And then you expand the radius and you expand the radius. Right? And so I'll go ahead and stop here, inshallah. If there are any questions, we can take the questions. Or even if someone just wants to share something, that's fine as well. We can discuss that. Khair, inshallah. If there's no questions, then we can end here, inshallah, and perhaps we'll meet again next semester. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallah bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.